We are delighted to have a wonderful panel this morning, kindly sponsored by the Havrelichen Foundation. And on that note, without further ado, I'd like to hand the microphone over to Christine Havrelichen. Welcome.
Hello. Welcome. Thanks for all being here. I'm going to do a very, very short introduction. My father, Bogdan Havrelichen, believed in the power of people, but the power of ethical people. He created a foundation years ago, and when he passed away, my family decided that we wanted to pursue his mission. My sister is here with me. She's on the board of the foundation. And our mission is to empower young people through training in good governance and exposing them to different experiences in the Western world, primarily Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, but also Switzerland, a great place for direct democracy, Germany, Austria, and Poland. I just wanted to introduce this panel because I think it's important. Last year was the 70 years of the UN Declaration for Human Rights. It was a momentous moment in 1948, post-war. We had to promote human rights. Unfortunately, and this is why my father discovered, over the years, human rights were taken as an individual right, something that people were entitled to, without realizing that with every right, there's an obligation. So my father developed what he called the Code, or the Charter of Human Obligations. You have them on your seats. There are 15 obligations to remind us all that there's always a counterpart. If you have a right, you have an obligation. So part of this panel is also to talk about, what is meaningful? How can we get to that better society? And nowadays, it's a very topical issue. We need to reflect on not only what we can receive, but what we can give back. Ukraine is an incredible example. Youth is incredibly dynamic in trying to set up the rule of law, good governance, and our foundation modestly is trying to contribute to that. You can find out more through the little brochures we gave you at bhfamily.org. We have a couple of programs. One of them is called Young Generation Will Change Ukraine, because we believe that the young generation is the one that's actually going to change Ukraine. You also have little packages of seeds. They're sunflower seeds in the name of my father, Bogdan Havrelichen, who, by the way, was at the origin of the World Economic Forum. So it's also topical for us to be here. And thank you for the sponsors and organizers for that. So without further ado, I'll leave it to Katie, who's going to moderate the panel with our very warm thanks to speakers and the moderator.
Thank you very much. My name is Katie Ward, and I'm founder of Build Strong Cities. It's a global consultancy doing economic development with municipalities. And after working in 12 countries and 60 cities, I relocated to Ukraine. Totally unexpectedly, was approached by a client and said, look, there's a huge opportunity. Would you come and start doing some work in Ukraine? And I took the opportunity. And by happenstance, I found a brochure similar to this on the floor in a museum. And I picked it up, and it had the 15 principles on it. And I read it, and I thought, my job would be so much easier if people lived like this, because I do economic development, and it's working with governments, with civil society, lots of stakeholders. I thought, wow, it would be a lot easier. So I approached Dr. Havrelichen. We had a great conversation about what could be the next steps for this. And he said his dream is to have a charter of human responsibilities. And I said, okay, let's start. So we started modestly. He passed away. We kind of lost a little bit of momentum, but then together with the family, Tusha Shmorhun is here, Havrelichen is here as well, and Christine and their brother Les, we have kind of brought up this narrative and discussion. Launching last year, we started the campaign here in Davos. Christine mentioned Bogdan Havrelichen was a co-founder. Klaus Schwab was his student, his employee, and it was called the European Management Economic Forum then, and it's grown into this. So we thought, what a fitting place to be having this conversation. And this year's theme for WEF is Globalization 4.0, as we've talked about, and it's addressing inequalities, but also how this digital revolution is maybe a solution to challenging or breaking down inequalities. So we've invited Anna Maria Corazza-Bildt and Gert Sylvestre. So we're going to have a view from the, global politic European dynamic side, I'll give a proper introduction to each of our speakers. And then from the digital emerging technology, emerging market side. So we can discuss the issue of equality, of globalization, of the fourth industrial revolution, which is the digital revolution from many perspectives. So we'll start with Anna Maria is a Italian-Swedish politician and member of the European Parliament from Sweden. She's the first vice chair of the Committee on Internal Market and Consumer Protection. She's the European Parliament coordinator on children's rights. There's so much I could read. So but it's important to note that you're an activist for human rights and an entrepreneur outside of your work with the European Union. So I want to lead with you. We had a great conversation on the train coming in about this idea of inequality and challenging the notion that globalization has created inequalities. It's been a huge discussion topic here. And some of the problems, or you pointed out some of the problems that are fundamental to those inequalities, and I'd love to hear your perspective from the governance point of view, European Parliament, European Union, what that looks like and what's systemic about inequality and creating it.
Thank you, Kelly. Let me tell first that my claim to fame here is to be a friend of Christina and Patricia, and I'm belonging to the fan club of BH, if we can say so, since we are here, and that I do feel at home in the Ukrainian house. Slava Ukraina is the first thing I would like to say with all my heart. Please applaud to Ukraine. I've been serving in the Joint Commission for Ukraine in the European Parliament. I'm so proud and happy to have this opportunity to visit, to meet amazing Ukrainians that give me a lot of hope for the future of Ukraine, of Europe, of the world. Inequalities exist. They have not been created by globalization. Globalization has definitely been a force to deal with inequality. We meet more, we communicate more, we connect more, we trade more. And that has lifted out of poverty millions of people. And that's important to say. Then some countries have managed globalization better than others, doing the right reforms to reap the benefits and to make sure that the benefits are distributed and equally benefited by people. Don't blame globalization for the failures of national governments to deal with distribution of the resources that globalization has created. And the other thing I would like to say, of course, there has been an increasing of world population, which means that some of the benefits of globalization have to be also put in balance with the fact that we have a demographic explosion, that women are in some countries having 6, 7 children. So that, of course, makes that, unfortunately, many people are still in poverty, and we still have to do a lot to combat poverty and extreme poverty. But globalization is fundamentally has been good and is good for humanity. And I know it's not popular what I'm saying, but I stay for it.
No, that's good, and that's why we invite you, because you always say strong points of view. So when you talk about then governance, and this is an interesting question linked to the inequalities, bringing together, so European Union brings together many different cultures, many different societies, views of the world. And this is another thing that we're looking at, is how do we integrate all of these different cultures and social realities to create a shared identity, or more importantly, what we want to talk about is shared values, a value system that we can agree on and say, yeah, this is how we think we should behave in society in order for it to flourish.
Well, the European Union is a community of shared values, which is based on the rule of law. The greatness of the European Union is the rule of law. And I think it's important not to forget our history. We had 2,000 years of war and bloodshed and 70 years of peace. You might spend your life criticizing the European Union, but give us a better alternative. And we have not seen this better alternative yet. And if you see the implosion, polarization, splitting, separation, unfortunately, I say with broken heart, that the current Brexit process is bringing in after 2 years. We have not yet seen the light of the tunnel. So this is as far as we see the alternative that we have from the European Union in Europe. Then the European Union is, of course, not perfect. That's why I'm proud to serve inside, to reform it, to work on it, to do better, and it's about joining forces. And then the European Union is not just the European Union. We are a global superpower when it gets soft powers. We're the biggest humanitarian organization in the world, with the biggest voice for civil liberties and human rights. I'm very proud of that. In the world of Trump and Putin, it's important to say We are standing up for people in prison, for people that are tortured. It doesn't mean we are solving all the problems, and then we are reaching out. And I would like to say trade is important. We have 70 global trade agreements that are bringing, not only lifting people out of poverty, bringing wealth, of course, to the people of Europe and to the people of the world involved, but we are also exporting standards of food safety, of respect of privacy of people online. We are also exporting high standard for toy safety, that children shouldn't work, and so on and so forth. So that's something that is often overlooked about your role in the world. We should do much more. I think that's the big reform that the European Union needs, to have a stronger voice in the world in terms of common foreign policy, common security policy, common defense policy. It's unacceptable and a scandal that we couldn't do more for the war in Syria, that we cannot do more for the war in Yemen, that we have not done enough after the war in Libya to get a functioning state. So these are the issues where we need a much stronger European Union.
You said earlier you are a human rights activist. Yes. And it's so great to hear a politician use the word activist, because I think most politicians do not want to be associated with that word. So thank you for saying that, because it's so important to state openly your values. So can you share a bit about that work that you're doing and why now it's so important? Because I know you've done a lot on children's rights, women's rights. These have been passions for you. And even in Ukraine, you've come and you've helped to raise gender equality in that country as well. So can you share, why that activism is so important in a leadership role like where you are, and some of the work you're doing in that to support your various roles in the European Parliament?
Yeah, together with many others. Of course, it's not only me, many of my colleagues, activists in a way. I am happy to support campaigns, initiatives on female genital mutilation, against forced marriage for girls, children soldiers, of course, for the environment and sustainability. I'm happy to put a T-shirt, if you can help spread on the social media, a campaign that some NGOs, some civil society organization that I trust and consider credible, of course, not whoever is knocking at our doors, and to build consensus and bring others from all political groups, because that's the strength, when we can get politicians over political boundaries to support campaigns for civil society. In Europe at the moment, I think one of the causes that is very worth being active is to support women's rights, because we see that some of the gains we had achieved are not at all obvious anymore, and in some societies we go backwards. What I see, Katie, is that populism goes together with sexism. And unfortunately, we see it also throughout Europe, in the countries where extreme right got to power or is influencing power. Civil society is shrinking, human rights are shrinking. We see Poland, we see Hungary, we see to a certain extent Bulgaria, we see Ukraine, unfortunately. I'm in charge in the European Parliament on the work on violence against women and the Istanbul Convention. Yeah. And there is so much gender ideology when we try to say, this is about fighting rape. This is about fighting domestic violence, that you shouldn't be beaten up. And then they say, no, it's against traditional values. It's against the family. Bullshit. So these campaigns, I think it's important. We've been supporting Czerny protest in Poland, the women of Ukraine, the women of Croatia, just to mention some. Yeah. But the key is joining forces across political groups. That's the way I'm working.
That's so important, because you mentioned also populism and how polarizing it is, where different groups start to create or articulate their value system. This is, we're separate and distinct, and here's why. And sort of this need, as you're pointing out, cross political spectrums, but also cross cultural spectrums, to define universal values, to say that these are things that we can, as society or as people, as human beings, other identities aside, gravitate to.
Okay, in the world, we have the Chart of the United Nations. This constant debate that the West is trying to impose its values on the South and so on. No, I think it's the value of the European Union is respect of diversity. Yeah. That's our strength. So, respect whatever religion, whatever culture, whatever tradition, as long as it's not justified, for instance, to for violence against women, because no religion, no culture, no tradition can be a justification to, for female genital mutilation, etc., for slavery of children. So globally, in the European Union, we have the Lisbon Treaty. We have a community of values. This idea that in Hungary they can do whatever they want. No, they can't. Because they are members of the European Union. And we share Article 2 of the Lisbon Treaty, which says human dignity, tolerance, anti-discrimination, free media, academic freedom, freedom of expression. If you don't like it, you have to reconsider being member of the European Union. It's not a different view, it's not a different opinion, it's not a different religion. It is the values that are in the Copenhagen criteria, which are the conditions for you to be a member of the family. So we have the right to ask all the members of the European Union to uphold these fundamental values. It's not Europe à la carte. That's why we have taken measures, and we are in dialogue, of course, because we solve our problems in dialogue based on the rule of law with Hungary, with Poland, with other countries that just say we want the money of the cohesion funds, the social adjustment fund, the structural fund, the agricultural fund, but we build walls to refugees instead of sharing in solidarity, the sharing responsibility for welcoming those who have the right of international protection in Europe. Just to take an example.
No, a great example. It's inspiring, as much as European Union isn't perfect, to see this approach to shared values, so I'm going to turn it back to the proposed Charter of Human Responsibilities, because this is you're talking about the Lisbon Agreement. It's a European Union.
It's a treaty.
It's a treaty.
Thank you. And you have adhered to it voluntarily. No one has forced you, including Great Britain.
Okay, so so how do we do something at the United Nations level? This is, our big dream. You had a chance to read Dr. Haverlishen's 15 proposed human responsibilities. They're on your seats, everybody. If you have brochures, you can take a look. So wanted to hear from you. Actually, some of them are written on these purses. You'll hear about this project a little bit later on the stage. You've had a chance to look at them. Which stands out for you of this visionary list of 15 human responsibilities? Oh, I don't have, Gert, do you have your copy?
I just want to say that for the first, if I may be personal, I get very moved when I read them. I am admired that Tina and Tricia live up to them and have, through the foundation, really brought them for us to share them and enjoy them. It's really amazing what you're doing as two sisters and your brother, and it's very difficult to pick up because they're all relevant. In this world and Europe of populism, I mean, my first choice would be free. That's so powerful. Be free, it's the best message you can send to any human being. Some people don't have the choice to be free, unfortunately. But the last one would be, now I don't have my glasses, women over 40.
You can read it?
Yeah, you can read up the last one. And why I pick up the last one? Because read it and then I will explain.
It's a responsibility to the world, because some of the responsibilities are to your family, to community, to society. This one is a responsibility to the world, and it says, be tolerant and respectful of all races, ethnicities, religions, languages. Learn some languages and at least basic things about other civilizations. Promote the understanding of the diversity of civilizations.
Yeah, and why do I choose this one, although they are all relevant in my view? Because this wave of populism has put people against people again, has identified the big enemies, the big scapegoats. Then, if you have a different race, a different color of skin, if you are too much feminist, if you are an LGBTI, that's, one of the big scapegoats. Unfortunately, I want to say it with really, it's a scandal. And also, again, anti-Semitism and, Soros. You start to pick up these enemies, which is absurd, unacceptable. It's a scandal. We have to stand up against it and have the courage to denouncing and do something about it. And that's kind of a roadmap, tolerance.
Yes. Thank you very much. With that, we're going to turn it over to Gert. I'll give you an introduction. Thank you for that perspective on EU and governance and the bigger questions, which though, you started on globalization and trade, and so we invited Gert Sylvest, one of the founding CEOs of TradeShift, because TradeShift is one of those organizations that's really actually shifting the paradigm in the digital transformation. The technologies you produce are now used around the world. I think one of your products, like over 90% of Danish businesses are using it. So, you've done remarkable things. And he has a great story, we won't be able to hear it all, but when the government of Denmark opened public sector information kind of as a project, entrepreneurs like Gilt began to program, test, and develop new softwares and applications, which allowed companies to understand how to use their own data. And this changed fundamentals for their clients, giving them the ability to access finance and markets because they could use data as an asset. And this is something that, was part of the new digital economy, part of the great equalizer of globalization 4.0. So, using open data principles, Sylvest and his two partners created TradeShift, which is an open business platform facilitating commerce and trade. So we've heard, even you've mentioned this, open data is increasingly connected to the creation of new products, new services, and taking down data silos. And we know that, in emerging markets, technology is actually viewed really differently. People feel positive about how digital technology can create and build their economies or economic development more equitable. So I'd like to hear from you, Gert, because you've been on this journey, I would say, of shifting perceptions of competition and inclusivity in digital space. Because the idea of sharing did not exist when you started this type of work. So can you share with us right now how inclusivity became an important value for your business and why that's important for your business?
Sure. So just a few words. I should say I'm co-founder of TradeShift. I'm heading up today our emerging technology labs. So I helped kind of establish the fundamental platform, and I guess that also tells what is my perspective. I'm a technologist, and actually I think where the journey started was really 7 years before founding TradeShift. I worked together with my co-founders. And we worked in the Danish public sector on various projects that actually had to do with, first of all, open access to data. And I have to mention my co-founder, Mikkel Hibbe, who was one of a great promoter of that agenda, I think, in the Danish public sector, amongst other with projects that mapped all the data in Danish public sector institutions in order to make them available for citizens as well as other agencies. And as part of that work, the group that he worked in started looking at, the trade relationships between the Danish public sector and all the Danish businesses that are suppliers to the Danish public sector, and that's more than 60% of all companies in Denmark. So the idea was to create an open standard that allowed companies to trade in a digital fashion with the Danish public sector. And the idea was very simple. It was really about efficiency gains you could have by interacting digitally. In principle, you should be able to pay suppliers without having a human intervention. But I think the interesting thing that we saw when we looked around and looked at the industry that dealt with digitization of supply chains was that they were all based on closed network models. So you would be invited into a closed proprietary network. It would typically represent the buyer. So a big buyer would ask their suppliers to join a network and interact digitally. And typically the sellers would pay for this interaction. So I think as we came kind of grown up with the internet and all of us technologists, it seemed absurd that you had to pay for basic interaction with other people. And we know from our personal lives, we have probably between 2 and 3 billion people connected into social networks. You're used to, completely free and instant exchange of information. And it seemed that in the business world, it was the total opposite of that. There's very little connectivity, almost no digitization, and there was a very kind of distinct power relationship between those who were the big buyers and the small suppliers. So instead, a model that we chose was to actually build this trade platform as a peer-to-peer network. So we were inspired by things like file sharing services, and that is the basic idea that you don't need a controlling middleman that that sits and decides how to distribute information. And you could remove the barriers for people to participate because there's no upfront payment. It's basically, you could say, almost a kind of governance structure. You agree on the standards involved, and you agree on the fundamental processes in exchanging information. And in 10 months, we had 60,000 companies live on that. So again, I should say that's before Tradeshift, that's in the public sector. It became a blueprint in several of the Scandinavian countries. It became a European project that connected infrastructures of 13 countries. And at that point, we started saying, you know, there's something interesting here that seems to break the adoption curve, because you've been trying to digitize supply chains for the past 40 years. And I think you saw other effects, and one of the, I think, key ones is just looking at the value that is locked up in supply chains today. And according to some estimates, it's between $7 and $9 trillion. And it's a very simple thing. It's like, you are my supplier, I buy something from you, and you owe people money, but you don't pay them until 30, 60, 90 days after. And that's a tremendous amount of value, and it clearly benefits the largest player on this. So one of the kind of guiding principles, and I think that really excites me and my co-founders in this, is that through the simple act of digitization and giving all companies in the world the basic same access to operate a digital supply chain, you could potentially unlock all of this value for the participants. And if you look at World Bank reports, you know, number 1, 2, and 3 on the challenges, that's access to finance as a challenge for the micro, small, and medium-sized companies, and it's access to market. And then there's something about political conditions that prevents companies from developing their business. So there's a tremendous potential there.
You want to jump in? Go ahead. Go ahead. Yes, because we should mention that that Anna is very diverse and also works in the digital chair of World Economic Forum, and recently worked in the European Union exactly on this issue on digitization and trade. So absolutely jump in.
I think it's so great what you're doing, and it shows how things have changed with the digital revolution. One should really highlight it's changing all our life in everything we are doing. And it's not anymore politicians that are in a driving seat. It is digital entrepreneurs like you who are driving the digital revolution and all the benefits it's bringing and it can bring. And we are just at the beginning of it, of what it's going to bring. So I think our role as policymakers is really, I mean, we really need to adjust to disruptive technologies and disrupt politics, which does not mean destroy like populists and extreme right want to do. There's a difference between disrupt and destroy. But we have become, by those who rule and control, I think, those who have to facilitate and enable, which means giving the legal framework, a framework, not top-down detailed rules, the legal framework that gives legal certainty and future-proof legal, so that a company like yours can thrive. And that's really difficult for policymakers because, there is this instinct that we are the ones solving the problems and the issues. So it's very fascinating to see. And also I would like to say there's another danger that is very important for me, what you're saying, is that, I stand for global, free, and safe internet for all. Not everyone does, although it looks obvious. There's a lot of policymakers that want to protect, for instance, European digital space. They want to keep out the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons, and because we feel that we have not yet created in Europe the level playing field, which means that we cannot have the scale that they have gained in the United States. So instead of taking down the walls, taking down the hinders, taking down the bureaucracy, taking down all these different rules that make we don't have a market of 28 member states free, but we have all the different rules in the different member states, which means a company like yours, for growing from Denmark to other member states, has to go through a lot of lawyers and consultants and etc. While in the US they have a scale. So the focus should not be to keep out the others that manage to be champions, but it is to create the level field in Europe. So what did we do? Well, I was in charge for a regulation, which is really actually a game changer, which is creating the 5th freedom in the internal market. In Europe we have freedom of goods, freedom of movement of people, freedom of movement of services, freedom of movement of capital. And now we have created a freedom of movement of data. It's very new. It's going to enter into force now in the spring. So no one knows because it's so new. But it's really basically saying, you member states, you cannot block Gerd company from finding the best cloud provider wherever it is in Europe, which is most cost efficient, to store and process this data, which means open space for data. And that's really the ground of your work, of artificial intelligence, of big data analytics and everything that will bring really jobs, competitiveness, growth, and it looks very technical, that's why it's frustrating, but it's so important. On the Googles and so on, I'm not just saying we should, we have a constant dialogue with them. And it's very, I met one of the vice presidents this week in the European Parliament on everything from copyright to privacy to respecting people's integrity, of course, to combat fake news, to help us and work with us on combating terrorism and radicalization and remove illegal material, to combat sexual abuse of children online. So we have a constant, making them accountable, work with us and do more on these issues. So I'm not just saying.
Yeah, thank you for sharing the piece, because there is a enabling legislative framework that has to be in place in order for this to happen. And Gert, I'm sure you want to respond to that, but if you could also mention, because not only is it a legislative shift, it's a mind shift, because you need, in your case, to get people to share data. And sharing is a basic human value. We're taught this as children. Share your toys, sharing. And so, but it's so hard in business because it's competition. So maybe you could also respond, but also speak to how did you guys manage to do this fundamental shift in a competitive environment to get people to share? Because you need this legislative framework in place, but then this conceptual framework that it's better if we share and collaborate.
I think that's a good question. So I think the fact that the world is made up of a lot of silos of kind of knowledge, of data and so on, that's a very defining factor. And I read an interesting survey by Pew Research, which is a US-based research institution that makes many kind of surveys about public sentiment. And one of them was about the public sentiments towards social networks. And they've actually made that service repeatedly over a number of years. And if we look at the kind of early 2000s and the sentiment of my age group, it would be flatly against social networks and denying, ever having the desire to join one of those social networks. And I think in just a few years that perception changed totally. Yeah. So now, it's actually more, the grandparents of my daughter that are using social networks, maybe more even than I'm doing. So there's a fundamental shift. And the debate was a lot about what is going to happen. We're sharing very personal information. We are kind of breaking down the division between our personal social networks and our colleagues' networks. And we are sharing pictures and things that are maybe personal to the family and so on and so forth. And that perception changed really, really rapidly. And I think that's kind of one of the factors that behind the growth of social networks and mobile phones and whatnot, that's actually the social networks have been driving, let's say, the latest phase of the growth of adoption of internet. But if you look to the B2B world, everything is still made of services. So if you join, let's say, a digital supply chain in the business world, it's based on, you can almost always take the exact principles of social networks, you can turn them on their head. There's very high barriers of entry. It's very well regulated. It's an exclusive club, so big buyers invite, big suppliers. And it's characterized by the data silos inside of the organizations like ERP systems. But that also means that all the value that you could potentially unlock of all that data never gets unlocked. And I think for good or for bad, that's one of the things that the social networks showed, that how, when you can actually get people to share information, you can enable completely new business models that didn't exist before. And then there's an interesting debate, which is, of course, we had a panel the other day on centralization versus decentralization. Are the decentral models overtaking the central models? And there was actually the sentiment that it seems in some respects that we have gone towards greater centralization. So you look at the big platforms like Google is a good example, Amazon is a good example. It seems that there are very few people, platforms in the world that seems to be taking over a whole lot of the world's electronic business and interaction with users. So how can this actually be? And I think it's basically down to, we have not seen yet the emergence of platforms that allow people to utilize their own data for example, in the B2B world where we are still log data in. And one example I think I spoke about is the access to finance. So basically, if I'm a small company today and I'm trying to get a loan or credit line because I'm waiting 90 days for payment, basically if I go to a bank and fund, the first question they will ask is, who are you? What's the solidity of your business? But fundamentally, the qualities of my business lies in my trade relationships. Who am I selling to? Have I shipped goods that are on the road? Has my buyer accepted that I'm going to deliver the service? And you could fundamentally take the risk out of providing finance to all these players. So it's very much related to let's say, the siloification of data. And that's a development I'm really curious to see. That is when also in the B2B world we start actually tearing down some of those data silos. What is the actual kind of socioeconomic impact on trade going to be?
You're dying to comment again.
It's music for my ears.
Okay, good. Yes, this is why we put you two together.
I didn't know it, believe me. But I would like to invite you to have a look at the report that we actually, since we're in Davos, I should say, was presented 2 days ago here on Innovative Europe, where digital leaders, as they call it, from the World Economic Forum, I was dealing with the part of access to data, and there was a bunch of amazing startups, CEOs, digital leaders, that we put together as a starting the conversational report and involving people like you to give feedback and say, what can we do? It was exactly about this, how we can open data also in the B2B, because it's enormous potentials that are untapped that can really change the way also Europe competes and creates wealth and jobs and growth for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting dynamic. So we are used to social networks and there have been quite a few media coverage and scandals around this lately, that you actually give up a lot of your personal data and you don't really have control over what you get in return for those kind of data. And usually it's a one-trick pony. It's basically, I guess, some advertising that might fit my taste or my desires or whatever. But it's basically pretty much the single value proposition that a lot of these platforms offer you today, and you have no choice. I think the interesting thing is that if you look at the B2B world, companies are fundamentally not going to accept sharing their data and not having control over what they get in return for sharing of this data. So you're not going to see large enterprises just sharing the list of all their clients or the list of their suppliers or their detailed trade information. No, it has actually been a barrier for digitization that companies are very reluctant to do that. Yeah. So I think some interesting things we'll see, and that is when businesses start to put their trade online, that they will make this strong push for, no, I have to be in control of my data, who I want to share it with, and who can actually help be a partner in extracting value of that data. And maybe we will see that will actually have an impact on kind of the consumer technologies and the social networks that we are seeing.
It shifts in many ways the perception of the business environment, because it's an idea of sharing, because in order to share you can discover something new or grow, but then also having control over how you package and share information. I shared with Gert yesterday, I read a business case analysis about Singer sewing machines from like the 1900s, and they did some revolutionary things, and it reminded me of TradeShift, because TradeShift reminded me of them, I'm not sure. Anyway, they created, there was competition and nobody could really sell sewing machines because this was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, because they were all suing each other because different patent holders held patents to different parts of the sewing machines. And so nobody could really make and sell sewing machines because they were all constantly in lawsuits with each other. And revolutionary, first ever patent pool, they came together and said, isn't it better if we just make a patent pool? We put all our patents together. We pay a percentage of sales of all of our branded sewing machines into the patent pool, which we redistribute equally among us, and then we can just grow our businesses. And that revolutionized that one industry. And so this is what we're fundamentally talking about now, is data sharing, right? They came together and said, why are we suing each other over our patents? Share the data. Now we can all make a product and we can go competitively, and you can distinguish yours, by your ways and I can distinguish it by mine. So how do we again get that shift? Because I think you're leaning towards that in the work that you do, to shift the perspective on, if you share, you can grow, and if you share, you find new opportunities, and it might even mean you look at your business differently. Because in turn, Singer wasn't the best sewing machine on the market, but they created the best distribution system. So it changed the way that they looked at their whole business when they looked at their data. And so how is that now, where you're at with the products you're developing with your clients?
Yeah, it's definitely a trend, no matter if we speak to CEOs or CPOs or the financial leaders of companies, that they are really reorientating themselves towards looking at the agility of the company. Of course, always the efficiency, but it's more and more recognized that your ability to be agile directly impacts your ability to compete in whatever industry you are in. Because patterns of demand are changing very, very rapidly. You have to follow as a company. And that really puts a spotlight on the supply chains, which for decades have been optimized for efficiency. And that means you put a lot of investment into the direct materials part of your supply chain, your direct supply chain, and you drive efficiencies there. You do it in the way that you drive your spend, you negotiate contracts with a few key suppliers. But that also means that you might end up with a very static supply chain when then demand suddenly changes. And you used to be pretty much more in control, at least if you're a large enterprise, you could direct money towards marketing and shape the demand. But social networks and other phenomena have changed that pretty rapidly. So I think for actually the past 20 years, there has been a pretty strong awareness that agility is a kind of a prime differentiator in how you drive your business. So one trend I'm recognizing is that the companies start talking maybe less about the supply chain, which is a very kind of, I'm in the center of the universe, I can look forward, I can look backwards, to talk about almost the ecosystems of trade, where you recognize what is the role of your suppliers, the logistics providers, the people who provide protection of your supply chain in the terms of dispensing finance. And I think everyone realizes almost no companies have any kind of visibility into their supply chains. So the kind of the roots of the tree, you don't know how things are produced. You don't know who are the suppliers. You don't know what is the risk in your supply chain. You cannot take responsibility for what you produce and how you deliver it to your end customers. And I think it has been no lack of standards or technology for the past 40 years, yet no adoption of digital supply chains. Why? Because I think everyone asks themselves in the supply chain, what's in it for me? To digitize, to share information, to change the way that I'm operating. And I think companies are now realizing that the only way that they can change this trajectory and achieve digitization of supply chains and human life scales, that is if you start sharing in the value that you get out of trade. And I think a key enabler for that is just look at the 7 to 9 trillion locked up in supply chains. It's just an inefficiency. And if you can start sharing your data, you can actually unlock part of that value and use it to drive, your CSR agenda, the way that the companies evolve themselves and mature, insight into the supply chain, get people to register, understand, where is the palm oil coming from, all of these effects. But you have to distribute value into the supply chain. I think companies are realizing that at a pretty grand scale today.
So you mentioned, inclusivity and sharing. Sharing is caring. That's what my parents taught me. Other values, because I want to go back to now the Charter of Human Responsibilities and the sort of these values that are guiding governance, society, business, even transition in business as we change mindsets and how we engage in trade and value systems. You've also had a chance to look at the list of 15. Which one stood out to you as something really, this is something that makes sense either in your personal world or in your trade world as something like really important that needs to be discussed?
Yeah. I looked at two. I think there's one which is about maintaining your identity while being conscious about the global community.
Yep.
And I think that fits very, very well with the kind of time and age that we live in, that, it used to be maybe a point that you read in philosophy books, these exotic religions where people talk about everything being connected. But today it's just super visible for anyone that you are connected with people in Hawaii and Indonesia and you chat with them, and that if you order stuff, I ordered this in China and it's here 2 days. So I think everyone has a very direct appreciation how things are actually connected in the world today. But it's maybe hard to deal with it sometimes, how to understand. So that's one. I think the second one is maybe treat others as you'd like to be treated yourself. I'm an engineer. I'm not an activist, but I think I come from a very egalitarian society, and that I think is connected with the other one that you get very kind of maybe conscious about when there is injustice and you can see that other people have access to resources you don't have. As an engineer, I would tend to ask, why is that the case? And I think that's directly connected to, well, if there's uneven distribution of wealth, of resources and so on, which often are in supply chains and in trade, then why is that actually the case?
No, that's great. It's the golden principle and even the fundamental of sharing. Treat others as you want to be treated, because if you're willing to share, expectation is it's reciprocated in a respectful and meaningful way. So thank you very much, both of you, for taking time to be with us today. I would like to invite Tusha Shmorhun Haverlishin to talk about these purses that are in front of you, these gorgeous bags made in Ukraine.
Okay. First, thank you so much, both of you, for coming. I'm thinking you're giving us very direct boots on the ground, often not available to us in the daily matters of business and foundation work. So thank you so much. This is a project I'd like to say a couple of words about. We've heard a lot yesterday at Ukraine House about the strength of the association or the collaboration between municipalities, businesses and social activists. And this, on our level, is a little bit what we've done. So these purses were created at the initiative for the a gala that we had in Kiev in November last year to raise funds for our foundation. And Alina Kacharovska, who is a wonderful young woman entrepreneur, is developed a very strong value-based business in fashion, where she designs, produces, and sells bags and shoes. And so when we asked her if she'd be willing to participate as a sponsor to our gala through her fashion, she came up with a collection of 15 bags. We only have a few here today. Each one of them inspired by one of the 15 human obligations of the BH Charter. And so as you see, the reason is that, yes, we need to work at the global levels, we need to work at European levels, at corporate levels, but in the end, this is all about what you can do, you as an individual, to participate in the transformation and the betterment and a more equal world. So we wanted to bring this to a very, very daily expression. This is one of them, where you can actually identify with one of these obligations and wear it proudly. We added the hashtag so that it's not just a fashion statement, but it's actually a position that you're taking, that you identify with. We're very happy, much as they said yesterday, that through this collaboration with Alina Kacharovska, she has decided to incorporate corporate responsibility in her business model. We are entering a partnership together where she will probably she will announce how she's going to do it, but most likely Sell will be one of the first, probably the first fashion retailer in Ukraine to come up with collections that will be devoting part of the sales of these bags of this collection, BH15, to our foundation. She always has also will have another partnership with municipalities to beautify public spaces, and wants to involve retailers in Ukraine to participate to this project. So I think we've learned a lot as a foundation on how we can make things happen at Davos level, but also at everyday level. We still don't have anything for men, but maybe we'll think of something that men can, our dear men and partners in life and partners in crime can wear as well, proudly as we will. So, thank you very much. Maybe you have a few minutes for questions. Thank you very much for coming. Oh, and sorry, want to thank 3 great women who really have made this possible. All week, we have to recognize the incredible work and effort. Slava Zelinsky-Johnson, Alexa Chopiewski, and Lena Kojarny, amongst many in your organization committee. We are very, very appreciative and are honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We are actually like a few minutes before schedule, so are there any questions we have time to take? Everyone needs their coffee? Oh, good.
I have a question for you. You talk a lot about supply chain and how it can relate to, keeping people socially responsible. But you didn't mention anything about blockchain. And I bring that up. there's a lot of negativities about it, but bring that up as yet another opportunity to hold companies responsible through a blockchain type concept. I mean, either one of you can comment, but maybe.
No, I think it's a good point, and I think if you look at the blockchain use cases in the B2B space, aside from ICOs and anything, I think a lot of them are driven by the idea of kind of global, free, universal access to share of value. So even if you look at ICOs, they've got a lot of negative press, but it's again an example of where you basically say, I can create my company by having the whole world potentially invest in it. It's not very well regulated, so you have seen that gone very, very wrong. You see the decentralized exchanges of digital assets, including weird crypto coins and so on, but they're all kind of founded on that nation. I think that's also what's driving a lot of the use cases in the B2B space. And I think it's a very real reflection on two things. One is kind of the inefficiencies of the financial systems that exist in global trade today. So it can take me 10 days to transfer money. And I can understand why, young people and technologists say, why on earth should that be the case today? So that's one clear. Now I lost my train of thought. But I think that's clearly one thing. And then I think there's a question of digitization, which drives maybe the other part, and that's to say, digitization is actually a necessary step to drive transparency at scale in the supply chains. Because right now we have paper-based trade, and we can just realize that there is almost no transparency. And even large brands, when they try to understand, like Nestle or how is the palm oil source for what they produce, they work together with NGOs and commercial entities, pay a lot of money to send people with choppers on the ground and find out how things are happening. And you can only do that once a year, twice a year, and get a snapshot of what does your supply chain look like. So I think digitization is fundamental to drive transparency, and transparency is fundamental to drive accountability. And I think if you look at a lot of the blockchain cases, they center around that. That's not to say that you cannot solve it in other ways than through blockchain, but I think that's a kind of one of the fundamental ideas.
Great, thank you.
I think it's an amazing project you're doing, and I just have some few technical questions. For example, what was the annual turnover on your platform for the previous year?
So
this is not confidential information.
Yeah, no. So I mean, in terms of the volume we are moving, so between companies, and that's typically invoice and purchase orders, it's roughly $500 billion. So
$500 billion per year.
$500 billion per year. Yeah.
Last year on your platform.
Yeah, past 12 months.
Amazing, amazing.
Yeah. So
and few other things, like for example, when there is a commodity trade on the platform, do you reveal the purchase price, the sales price, logistics, or is it hidden info?
We reveal nothing, and I think that's a fundamental kind of principle that companies want to accept. That is that they own their data, they have control over their data.
Okay.
And fundamentally, if you go in and look at that data and use it for various purposes, you're creating an unjust system where basically it will be more favorable to some place than others. So I think that's a baseline principle that no company wants to compromise with, that is that we don't use their data to promote their competitors.
So basically members in the platform, they can have access to the prices of the commodities which is traded on the platform. Like
Look,
the exact purchase and sales price.
It works exactly like a smartphone, right? So when you install an app, the app will ask you, can I get access to your pictures, your GPS information, your contacts, and so on? And you have the decision to say yes or no. And that's how we deploy supply chain financing with our banking partners. That is, if you want to install this or that financing app, it will ask you if it can get access to insight into your trade relationships and your receivables flow and the acceptance of invoices. And that's basically how they can lower their risk in providing financing.
Amazing, amazing. And just last question, how many banks and funds are already like maybe funding your flows through the platform?
I should say, for full disclosure, this man is not a member of TradeShift.
Sorry?
Yeah, I should say for full disclosure, I don't think you are a TradeShift employee, but we have 10 of the largest banks on the platform today. Our goal is within 2 years to have 100 different financiers, institutional, non-institutional financiers, to address all the diversity of companies on the platform. So.
I just want to have a final word coming back to our key debate, which I think is value-based politics and value-based business. It's a spare commodity nowadays, and I see in front of globalization, digitalization, the uncertainty, insecurity, migration that people feel, you have two ways. One, exploiting, manipulating, playing with all these fears and telling people, quick fixes, we're going to set up walls, blow up bridges, close borders, and you're going to feel safe. And this is the easy recipe for paradise on earth, which is what populists are doing throughout the world, in Europe for sure, but also in Brazil, of course, United States, of course, Putin, Trump, and so on. And that is a very dangerous way to go. In Europe, we've seen where it leads. Yeah. It leads to war, conflict, devastation. That's the history of Europe. And the other way is correct. Is I think that people actually people don't want politicians or policymakers that just excite the emotion. I think people want politicians that is one of the charter points is solve problems. They want policymakers to sit down at the table with the business community, with the civil society, with the rights group, together. I think together is one of the key words in our time, in our world. Together, because no politician has a solution alone, no business leader has a solution alone. Together, and find out concrete answers to extremely complex problems and issues. Climate change, jobs, dealing with digitalization, dealing with, of course, sustainable development, inequalities, and so on. And the solution is together. And I think that people want build bridges, not build blowers, to solve the problems, even if not, it doesn't look obvious right now. So I hope there will be more people that have the courage to come out, like you with the foundation, to stand up for open societies. Open societies is the key to solve this problem, not closed societies. Thank you.
Thank you for those summarizing remarks, capturing all of the points we've been talking about in terms of values-based approach and open connectivity. So thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you for hosting us and for allowing us to be a part of this great space.
Thank you very much to our esteemed guests for taking the time to be with us today. We're truly grateful to you. Katie, Ward, as always, for your expert moderating. And to the Havrelishin Family Foundation, thank you very much for sponsoring this panel today. This family has done so much for Ukraine, and we are very, very grateful to you, and it's an honor for us to have you be a part of this week. On behalf of the entire Ukraine House Organizing Committee, Yaroslava Johnson, Lena Kojarny, Olga Afanasieva, and Svetlana Hrytsenko. Thank you very much, and thank you to our guests for joining us this week. We hope that you've gotten a lot out of it. It's been our pleasure to have you here. Thank you.